The Universal Monsters refers to the series of horror films produced by Universal and released between the 1930s and 1950s. The original Dracula from 1931 is regarded as the first of these, while 1956's The Creature Walks Among Us is seen as the last. Though there is argument to suggest that 1925's Phantom of the Opera was the true first Universal monster movie. This was the very first cinematic universe. It brought together monsters and villains from various gothic and sci-fi literature such as Dracula, Frankenstein, the Invisible Man, and the Phantom of the Opera, as well as creating new monsters such as the Wolfman and Creature from the Black Lagoon. Throughout this time, Universal churned out countless sequels for all their famous monsters. Some are brilliant, and others not so much. In the 1940s, these monsters began crossing over with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, in which Dracula actor Bela Lugosi replaced Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster. This then spawned other crossovers, such as the highly successful Abbott and Costello Meets series, as well as the two House of movies. There were other Universal horror films made at the time, but the monster movies are seen as the best and most memorable, so will therefore be the focus of this video. The movies often featured a similar set of actors, with Bela Lugosi, Boris Karloff, Claude Rains, and Lon Chaney Jr. appearing as multiple villains. In fact, Lon Chaney Jr., the son of original Phantom of the Opera Lon Chaney Sr., played not just the Wolfman, but Dracula's son, Frankenstein's monster, and the Mummy too. This was a period home to not just some of horror's greatest movies, but some of the most groundbreaking filmmaking and special effects in film history. The Spanish version of Dracula, filmed at the same time and using the same sets as the American version, contains some spectacular cinematography and is clearly superior to the original in many cinematic ways. These monsters are now iconic staples of horror.
It's alive! Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
Dracula, Frankenstein, his bride, the Mummy, the Wolfman, the Invisible Man, Gillman, and the Phantom are all instantly recognisable to even non-horror fans. The love for these monsters has endured for almost a century, but what makes them still so popular? Why are new and younger fans like myself still captivated by them? As The Office's Robert California once said,
"Fear plays an interesting role in our lives. How dare we let it motivate us? How dare we let it into our decision-making, into our livelihoods, into our relationships?" It's funny, isn't it? We take a day a year to dress up in costume and celebrate fear.
This celebration of fear, I think, is what best describes why I love horror, and specifically the classic monsters too. James Spader's character describes that fear motivates us and inspires our lives, and that is incredibly true. Whether that be our personal fears, failure, loneliness, high expectations, or the social commentary fears included in the aforementioned horror films. As a society, we've become aware of all sorts of issues on varying scales, from our own personal mental well-being to ensuring the survival of our planet. The stakes and the worries have never been higher. Our fear is what informs our every decision. Our fear of not being able to afford food and a roof over our head informs us to work. Our fear of loneliness informs us to create relationships and start a family. Our fear of failure is what informs us to have dreams and aspirations. Fear can also play a part in how we find leisure. The classic monster films are by no means scary to a modern audience. The core characters have been prestiged time and time again. Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula is now an archetype, and Boris Karloff's Frankenstein is now the collective consciousness image of the monster, even though an image of Glenn Strange's monster was used by newspapers to report Karloff's death. The original monsters have become a staple of pop culture. Everything from the Groovy Gang to Hotel Transylvania have taken a piece of the monster action and turned these once terrifying characters into child-friendly icons. Albeit a few notable scenes here and there, the monster throwing the little girl into the lake in Frankenstein being a famous example, these films no longer pack the scare factor they once did, but there is still a great fear that lives within them. For Dracula, it's his fear of death. For Frankenstein, it's his fear of being alone.
Alone. Bad. Friend. Good.
For the Mummy, it's his fear of being separated from his loved ones. For the Invisible Man and the Wolfman, it's the fear of not fitting into a society that once accepted them. For the Creature from the Black Lagoon, it's the fear of change. And for Claude Rains' Phantom of the Opera, it's the fear of failure. Whether or not we find the monsters themselves scary in today's climate is one thing. However, there is room to relate to each one of these monsters in what they find scary. This is where a modern perspective comes into play. I've seen previous articles criticise the snowflake view of the monsters being misunderstood, but I disagree. I've seen Rob Zombie make similar comments in various interviews, as well as comic book men's Walter Flanagan discuss the concept in an episode of the AMC show.
I think it started as a kid, because like a lot of people can relate to this. I didn't feel like I fit in. Like I was like weird. I didn't fit in. I didn't get like what were the cool shoes to wear or the right freaking Izod shirt. I didn't understand. I wasn't trying to be, no one's trying to be weird and like, oh yeah, I want to be weird and hide away because I'm weird. No, it's like, I don't understand. And I think when I would watch monster movies, the monster was always that mentality. Like King Kong's like, hey man, I'm just trying to get along. Why is everyone shooting at me? And Frankenstein's like, hey, I was just born yesterday. Why are you trying to kill me? Like, and I think as a weird kid, you relate to the monster.
For the kids who grew up with the monster movies being regularly played on TV in the 60s and 70s, they were characters they could relate to if they struggled relating with anyone else. For the loner, the outcast, the weirdos and the freaks, these monsters can be deeply personal and relatable. And I've personally always found a love for Gilman, one of the last films in the franchise, but The Creature from the Black Lagoon is one of my favourites. A character who is minding his own business, happy with the status quo and living his life, until a bunch of loudmouth scientists come prodding at his habitat. There is an obvious nature versus science debate here, but I really read into the idea of an individual that is happy in what they are doing, only to be provoked by negative influences. For a series of horror films that pack very few scares to a modern audience, it really begs the question as to why this then have a deeply personal meaning to so many people to this day, and I see this as key. For those who didn't grow up with these films on TV and had to educate and introduce themselves to the original House of Horror like I did, this personal connection can come not only from film buffs appreciating the filmmaking technicalities of the crew behind them, but also the way we can relate to the monsters themselves. Whether it's because of your race, creed, gender, sexuality or subculture, the feeling of being different is something all humans can relate to, a feeling so integral to the classic monsters. Therefore, the idea that the monsters are misunderstood is nothing new. If other kids like Rob Zombie and Walter Flanagan saw them as idols back in the 60s and 70s, then this is not a snowflake creation. Easily the greatest film of the Universal horror run is James Whale's Bride of Frankenstein. Atop the campy flair and stunning production design is a theatrical masterpiece laden with a blend of both subtle and blatant metaphors. The exploration of the monster's loneliness played between the creation of his bride and the monster's unlikely friendship with the blind hermit is the absolute highlight of all monster movies. Going into this film, many would be forgiven for expecting the titular bride to be the main character, but it is actually a deep character study into Boris Karloff's wonderful monster.
We belong dead.
James Whale was an interesting director, openly gay in a time when it was illegal to be so. The Bride of Frankenstein was a film he agreed to so long as he had complete creative control. As well as being a masterpiece of a film for the reasons mentioned previously, honestly, even if you don't typically like horror films, if you pride yourself on being a film buff, you need to see this film. It provides such a personal self-expression from Whale and helps add to this idea that the monster movies are deeply personal things.
Have a cigar. They're my only weakness.
The religious imagery in the film is especially poignant. The cinematography in the closing moments of the hermit scene is the best example of this. As the hermit gives the monster a place to rest and puts him to sleep, the scene begins to fade out. But as we fade, the crucifix on the wall stays visible amongst the black. There are so many readings into the significance of such a creative decision, whether it is an emphasis on the playing God debate from the previous film, or whether it is Whale's own expression against religious bigotry. There are many other detailed video essays out there that theorise over the deeper meanings of this film, and the significance of things such as two men creating life to a being who is shunned from society for who he is. If you've seen the film, what do you think he means? And if you haven't seen Bride of Frankenstein, then please go away and watch it. But when you finish this video, of course. Because of this personal connection to the monster movies, whether it's playing off our own fears and relating them to the monsters' personalities, or studying early cinematic filmmaking, this is why I think these films have a surviving fan base. It saddens me that there is a great disregard of these films among people in my generation. I know of people online or have friends on social media who are fans of these movies, but I don't know anyone personally who enjoys them. Perhaps an audience that exists in the USA with monster exposure in the Universal theme parks, but I'm yet to come across a youthful fan base here in the UK. A great deal of my peers judge a film's quality partly based on its diversity and representation. Due to the fact these movies, inevitably, do not hold up to our modern standards, they are perhaps ignored by a great number of people. This disappoints me as I don't believe we can judge films that are almost 100 years old on quotas only recently introduced. However, I think there is a way to get around this. If people are unwilling to scour their local DVD shops for monster movies as I do, a stint for these movies on a streaming platform such as Netflix or Amazon Prime could make a great deal of difference. Although they're in black and white and many don't enjoy this film experience, I think there's still a great deal of people who do, and therefore exposure to these movies could have an impact. Perhaps the best way to introduce these films would be by pursuing some successful remakes. Universal have tried to reboot the monsters several times. Recent attempts, such as Tom Cruise's Mummy, was to be the first in Universal's Dark Universe, though this ultimately led nowhere. However, the recent The Invisible Man proved to be successful and was actually a decent film. It succeeded in a way other Universal Monsters reboots have failed by honing the horror in on not just the concept, but the current issue of gender inequality and domestic violence. The monster in this movie was not just the Invisible Man, but the Visible Man too. Rather than making the monster the default main character, this film realised that concept and meaning is the more important idea. This is the route that Universal must pursue to make the monsters relevant again. Focus Dracula on a man abusing his position of power. Focus Frankenstein on the way society scapegoats those who don't seem to fit in. And focus The Creature from the Black Lagoon on climate change, just as a few examples. In the current landscape where everyone is after their own cinematic universe, creating a new one with their classic monsters, Universal might just create interest in the original cinematic universe at the same time. These monsters are so ingrained in our collective minds that there is already an audience for them. They just need to be done right. Whether that's in a remake or in a return to TV showings and streaming platforms. We all grew up with vampires and zombies on Scooby-Doo and other such cartoons. Anyone who does a Dracula voice in a Hungarian-esque accent is doing an impression of Bela Lugosi.
Listen to them. Children of the night. What music they make.
There can be a level of nostalgia that people bring to the monsters. Seeing their original source material can be interesting to see where every archetype or nuance comes from. The theming of this very page was based on the American monster craze of the 1960s, in which the monster movies were first shown on TV, and the youth of America went crazy for everything to do with monsters, whether that be toys, clothes or cartoons. Everybody is already a fan of the monsters, but they mean something different and personal to everyone. I sometimes wonder if my fascination with Bela Lugosi is due to the fact he looked eerily similar to my own granddad. While there are other cinematic universes and countless other horror films, many lack a personal connection. The monsters are familiar, the movie is amazing, but relating the monsters' fears to our own is what continues to make them truly special. The monsters will forever be relevant so long as human fears are relevant. The monsters will forever be relevant as cinema history too, the first cinematic universe and popular horror films.
Now that we've seen the last of Dracula, the Wolfman and the monster, there's nobody to frighten us anymore.
Oh, that's too bad. I was hoping to get in on the excitement.
Who said that?
Allow me to introduce myself. I'm the Invisible Man.
They have a great significance in culture that does not go understated. Even if people don't know Boris Karloff or Bela Lugosi by name, they for sure know what they look like, and even sound like, in the most famous roles. It just so happens that they are two of the nicest men in Hollywood history. Though there are stories that the pair had an infamous rivalry, one of my favourite stories about them comes from Boris protesting Bela's low pay for his role as Igor in Son of Frankenstein due to his nationality. When Bela's pay was eventually increased, he gave the greatest performance of his career.
Yes, he was hunting.
The monsters have been honoured time and time again with merchandise, statues, theme parks, homages and pastiches continuing to this day. As a 19-year-old who adores these films, I can only give my own perspective as to why they continue to be successful. I believe it is because of our personal connection. I recognise iconography, jokes and references from other things I've seen, but most importantly, the monsters' fears resonate with me. Also, with so many sequels and so much content, it's fun to constantly discover more and more films. Films that can teach us about ourselves, filmmaking, those who made them, or even act as a time capsule to represent society at the time. These films have and will go down in history. I just hope that the fanbase continues as more people, like me, seek out box sets and sit through hours of black and white monster fun. The Universal Monsters are the ultimate self-expression, and the ultimate celebration of fear. Just count how many Draculas and Frankensteins you see next Halloween. But that brings us to the end. Once I've finished every monster movie, there are still a few mummies I haven't seen. I'll perhaps do a review discussing which I think are the best and why. But until then, thank you for watching, if indeed you still are. I would greatly appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. If you have Instagram too, why not drop me a follow over at the Nowhere Collection. I have been The Collector, this has been the Den of Antiquities, and I'll see you next time.